Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Overkill, The Wings of War. Overall, I would say that Overkill has been a pretty consistent group when it comes to the quality of their releases and when it comes to, putting out material every few years. Despite the fact that this band has put out as many albums as they have, for the most part they've all been pretty, at the very least enjoyable, with some of the albums even managing to be pretty great overall. So I came into this new album here expecting it to be, at the very least, decent. And overall, that's pretty much what I got from this new album. Once again, this is another solid addition to Overkill's discography. It doesn't really change things up all too much from a lot of what the band had done previously on a lot of their previous releases. So if you were expecting for the band to do any kind of experimentation really, or anything all too different here on this album, you're not going to find that here. I feel like that could be this album's greatest weakness to some extent, is that really Overkill are still pretty much playing around with a lot of the same sounds and styles that they've done on previous projects. However, what I feel saves this project from just being yet another Overkill release is a lot of the energy that's really brought to the table here on this project, despite the fact that the band is playing around with sounds and styles that they've been doing for several decades at this point. They're still playing with the intensity of a young, hungry, and ferocious band. Overall, it's this intensity that makes listening to this album really enjoyable from start to finish. And there are some moments on this project where some of the tracks just aren't as interesting as others, or maybe one or two tracks stand out as being kind of weak in comparison. But overall, I would say from start to finish that this album is pretty enjoyable, especially if you're someone who's already a fan of this band and the sound that they've already forged for themselves over several decades. The opening track on the album, Last Man Standing, begins with a pretty unique intro, I'd say. It's probably one of the more out there moments on the project. The intro to this track is kind of electronic tinged, almost industrial sounding. If it sounds at first like Overkill are going to be delivering a pretty different sounding project given the first minute or so of this track. However, it does eventually transition over into a more typical Overkill song. However, I do still feel like this opening part of the track does help make it one of the standout moments on the project. The opening to this album is definitely a highlight overall, just for how different, but at the same time, good it sounds. The band also occasionally plays around with some softer sounding arrangements here on this album and some of the openings to some of the songs here. Tracks like Distortion or Where Few Dare to Walk are some of these songs that have some softer openings to them. However, eventually they do get a bit more energy to them and, transition into a more typical Overkill song. And overall, I feel like tracks like these allow for a bit of diversity here in the track list, despite the fact that, like I said, this album for the most part plays to a lot of the same sounds that this band has been playing for several decades at this point. These occasional moments of something slightly different really help the album stand out. There's also a good few moments on this album where the band decides to deliver a pretty solid hook overall, a pretty catchy chorus. Particular standouts would be the track Head of a Pin or the closing track Hole in My Soul. I feel like those two tracks definitely had some of the stickiest, most standout hooks on this entire project, and as a result, they ended up being some standouts on this thing. Most of the lyrics across this album are your typical thrashy, Overkill style lyrics, nothing all too much to talk about. However, I will say the track Welcome to the Garden State is a standout lyrically on this thing, mostly talking about the band's home state of New Jersey, which also happens to be where I am from, so I have a fair amount of knowledge about New Jersey, and it's really astounding that this band was able to write a song that has a kind of positive angle about New Jersey, considering what an awful place that is. I mean, there's bands out there who write songs about hell, or other types of dark underworlds, or what have you, and Overkill write a song about New Jersey, and they managed to top all of those existing songs about hell or whatever it is that's just this really dark, disgusting place, really. And at the same time, they managed to make it sound kind of positive too. A real standout moment on this thing, because that's a difficult thing to pull off. But in all seriousness, I do quite like the lyrics on this track. I love the really playful nature of them, and I like lots of the kind of, not necessarily in-jokes, but kind of things that you might only get if you're from New Jersey in here, references to things like the shore, the Jersey Devil, and just other kinds of disgusting aspects of the state and all of that. It's a pretty interesting track in that regard. I like the lyrics on this thing a lot, and it definitely stood out to me as one of the finest on the album as a result of that. Definitely the best song on this thing when it comes to the lyrics, at the very least. The overall sound and production of this album is pretty solid as well. All these tracks sound very thick and heavy. They're just really punchy, and they really add to that intense feeling I was talking about before that really helps sell this album as something a bit more than your typical dime a dozen thrash metal album that you could find pretty easily nowadays. It's that aggression and energy that helps set this thing apart, and the production and the overall sound of this project really helps tie that all together and help sell it even more. When it comes to weaknesses from this project, I already touched upon a lot of these things, but I would say the fact that this album is, a bit on the safe side when it comes to things like experimentation could be kind of disappointing to some extent. Like I said, for the most part, the energy that this album has going for it makes up for that lack of experimentation, but there are just some tracks on this thing that just end up feeling a bit typical or average overall. Tracks like Mother's Prayer, for example, or one of the tracks that comes towards the end of this thing, Out on the Roadkill. I just thought these songs were okay overall. Not bad songs by any means, but just kind of typical Overkill songs, if that makes any sense. Not ones that I feel really excited to return to in the future. But aside from that, I feel like this album is pretty solid from start to finish. I like a lot of the performances across this thing. The band really brings a lot of energy and intensity to this project that really helps sells it overall. There's lots of great riffs across this thing and solos, great vocal performances as well. It's a pretty solid album overall, and if you're a fan of Overkill, if you're a fan of thrash metal, then I think you're going to get some enjoyment from this thing. However, if you're not a fan of either of those things, or if you're just not a fan of albums that don't really, step out of their comfort zone and experiment a bit more, then I'm not sure that this will be an album for you either, because like I said, while there is a lot of really infectious energy on this album, it's not exactly a super experimental one for the band or anything quite like that. It's just another Overkill album, really. And while, Overkill have released a lot of these albums in the past that, have a very similar sound to this, like I said, this one is still pretty enjoyable overall, and I'm happy that the band has been able to keep up a pretty consistent level of quality throughout the releases. Overall, I would recommend this project to you, because I think it is pretty solid overall. Not one of my favorites of the year necessarily or anything like that, but still, a pretty solid album. And with all that said, that concludes this review here today. If you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate if you would leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Feel free to leave your own opinion on this album in the comment section down below. This is my own personal opinion when it comes to this review, so if you happen to disagree with me, that is fine. Feel free to leave your own thoughts down there in the comment section. Once again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.